attitude to change, attitude lens, is probably the most difficult to measure because it's the most subjective. So if you think of the instrument in a flight deck for pilots, the artificial horizon, imagine that you have your own personal artificial horizon with how you communicate to others. And you'll see how if you go too much on one side or another, what it does and how you can raise the flight towards an upward lift. That's basically the metaphor behind this. Now, Attitude to Change has got a video, so it's explained in this infographic, which is the video summary, which I'll post here. But if we simplify the flight instrument in the center you see here, type 0 is when your attitude is, for example, something happens in a meeting, there's change, there's chaos. Type 0 is resisting change, and there's always a good reason for it. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but there's resisting change. Type 1 is focusing on mostly the external world of to-dos and jobs and tasks. Type 2 is an attitude of mostly focusing on the internal world of learning and personal growth. So when problem occurs, they say, there's no problem, I don't want this problem. Here they say, let's make a to-do list of how to fix the problem. Here they go, let's go and Google it. And here, type 3 is when you embrace the best of both in dynamic balance in a way that is not overriding one or the other. Type 3 would be saying, okay, this is an opportunity to learn a little bit, but also get things done. So they might say, okay, let's do a quick search on a couple of tutorials and then build a to-do list from that so that we're more informed. And there's learning while doing. So we will call that the growth mindset. Now, that's essentially what those three postures are. Now, this is not from me. This is something that comes from a macro analysis of a lot of personal development literature. If you look at the self-help bookshelves, everywhere it's blossoming with this idea that you need to grow, cultivate yourself. Great. But what happens is that there's really two schools that have been emerging, almost competing. There's a lot of the personal development that's type 1 personal development. So it's like goal setting, life hacking, very behavior and result oriented personal development. And then you have the type 2 personal development, which is much more, you go off to an ashram for 15 years and meditate, focus within, focus on yourself. And they're both very useful, but they're very different in their application. And what I find is that in communication, what has been most symptomatic of leaders who are able to have conversations in collective intelligence, coaches, facilitators who are able to do a good job are generally type 3s. The type 1s end up being quite stressed and not very good at learning from their mistakes. People who take a type 2 posture generally end up lost into learning and without having any concreteness. But people in type 3 end up generally gravitating towards the world of startups because that's where you see the most type 3 attitude, where you literally have to learn all the time while doing. We're measuring, for example, in the data you'll see, bits of those attitude to change. Let's have a look. So this first one is your attitude to growth. So in the center score, for my case, is 9 out of 10. They're usually out of 10, these scores. If in doubt, it's out of 10. This is how much I'm focusing on growth. 9 out of 10. Quite naturally, I'm in a bit of a startup environment here. That's pretty common. The outer circle is showing either one of those four postures, attitude 0, resisting, 1, 2, and 3. So in my case, I'm more generally focused on an attitude 1, which means I'm more focused on the to-do list and the outer world than on the personal growth. Ideally, I would want to be on the 3, which is balancing both. So if your internal growth focus is low, this one, and if your outer is like mine, 1 or 0, or even 2, that's an invitation for you to think, how might I get more into a type 3, which is focusing on learning while doing with the right balance of both. The second data is showing those 4 levels. It's a second question to check for congruence between the 2 questions. So this one, yeah, I'm definitely doing. So that means that my overall attitude to change in communication is that I generally focus on getting things done. Nothing bad about that, but if I were to be in the growing mindset, I'd be more learning while I'm doing. So if you're in the 0, if you're more in a resistance to change, there might be a very good reason. You might be in a toxic environment. There might be a million reasons why it's a good thing for you to resist change. I'm not saying it's always a good idea, but if we are talking about your communication behaviors to help the collective intelligence build trust and relations, transform conflicts into trust, then attitude 0 is going to be counterproductive. Generally, an attitude 3 is the most conducive to building trust, because if you're learning as a leader, most people trust you more than if you don't ever learn anything new, because it shows that you're curious and interested about things and that you're up to date. So Generally, the type 3 attitude is a great one for building trust and lead by example to a lot of people in their personal development. So that's what we're looking for, aiming for type 3. Now, the next slide is really where we look at how you learn. Now, some of you might not have answered this, but this is really also focused on when we interact in workshops and we do coaching. This is also useful for people to formulate their needs to us so that we don't make the wrong assumption, because some people really just want ebooks, others want activation and example, and others only want face-to-face coaching, and that's perfectly okay, but everybody has their preferences. So this is kind of a little mirror back to you about what are your learning needs in the case of Green Elephant, but of course you can apply this to thinking about other needs. And the way I would use this particular data is to think, if I'm now learning something, I need to learn something quickly, look at this as your comfort zone, and that's a great way to start. Because if you prefer face-to-face coaching, but the first go-to reaction is Googling a how-to video in YouTube, you might not get much out of it. But if you quickly Google like the best coach on the topic, whatever style of learning needs that you have are going to be your best go-to strategy for becoming type 3 attitude and quickly learning while doing. So that's what this one is. So you're looking at which ones are useful for you. This one might be empty on your slide. This one is the overall average time in hours per week of learning that I do. 8 out of, a lot of people are doing 2, 3. But then again, how objective are they and what are they considered to be learning? In the formulation, it was learning in a wide sense. So not just learning in a course, but for example, tutorial videos for bug fixes counts as learning. So it might change a lot from one week to another. But if you're above 4 hours a week, that means that you're already putting a lot of that action learning in place. What we mean by action learning is this type 3 attitude, action and learning at the same time. In pedagogy, what action learning is really when you learn by doing, so you practice on prototypes and things like that. So action learning in work context means that you're learning on the job constantly, new things. This and this are to do with the Green Elephant's library. So if you've got none, that means that we haven't ever interacted. And this one is a key learning resources video at the time of this scan, which is going to evolve because we're building more. But the key resource, the official playlist of learning, which ones you've watched. If you are going to choose from our YouTube channel, those are good ones to actually start from, because that's the key concepts of the whole periodic table. So this is really just about an overall giving you a sense of how much you're really learning. If you're more than 8 hours a week, you're definitely doing action learning, and then you're just probably very humble about it. So attitude is about harmonizing your learning with your doing, so balancing them out over time so that you're not just learning and getting lost in things, or only doing to-do lists and never learning from mistakes. So that's the balance that this is bringing.